Hello and welcome! Today we're breaking down one of the most significant Supreme Court rulings in modern American history. And it's a big one that fundamentally reshapes the very nature of presidential power.
Okay, let's just start with this. This is a pretty stark warning, right? And it's coming from inside the Supreme Court itself. This captures the incredibly high stakes of the decision in Trump v. United States. So here's the bottom line. For the very first time, the court has created a brand new legal shield for presidents. This really changes a centuries-old understanding of what accountability looks like at the highest level.
All right, so here's what we're going to cover. We'll walk through how we got here, break down what the court's new framework actually is, explore the fierce debate it ignited, look at the real-world consequences, and then ask what could possibly happen next.
So, how did we get here? Well, our story really kicks off with a criminal indictment and a fundamental legal question that climbed all the way up to the nation's highest court.
So let's rewind a bit. After special counsel Jack Smith brings this indictment, Donald Trump's defense team comes out with a really bold claim: absolute immunity. And not just for a few things, but for any conduct within the outer perimeter of his official duties. As you can see, that argument was shot down, and shot down hard, by two separate lower courts.
Yeah, the trial court was having none of it. Judge Chutkan's words were pretty direct. The presidency isn't some divine right of kings. The message was clear: former presidents have to follow the same laws as everyone else.
And, the appeals court totally backed that up. They basically said, look, once he's out of office, he becomes Citizen Trump. They argued that the shield of the presidency just disappears. But that's where the story takes a turn. The Supreme Court decided to step in and have the final say.
So that's the big question, right? After two courts said a firm no, what did the Supreme Court do? Well, they didn't just say yes or no, they created something completely new.
Right. So instead of a straightforward answer, the majority, led by Chief Justice Roberts, came up with this really complex three-part test. It's like they created three different buckets for a president's actions.
Okay, so this table lays out the new rules of the road. Let's walk through it. First up, you've got core constitutional powers. Think things like issuing pardons or firing cabinet members. For those, absolute immunity. The courts can't even look at it. Then there's the middle tier, and this is a huge one: other official acts. Here, a president has presumptive immunity. That means the starting assumption is that they're immune, and it's incredibly difficult for a prosecutor to prove otherwise. And finally, you have unofficial or private acts. For those, there's no immunity at all.
But wait, there's more. The court added two new rules that make this shield even stronger. First, there's what's called the motive rule. Basically, it doesn't matter why a president did something. If the act itself looks official, you can't question the motive, even if it was totally corrupt. And second, the evidence rule. This is a big deal. It says you can't even use evidence of an immune official act in a trial for a private crime. It's like building a wall around that evidence.
So as you can probably imagine, this decision just split the court right down the middle, philosophically speaking. It really comes down to two totally different ways of looking at the presidency.
On one side, you have the majority's view. They're worried about protecting the office of the presidency. They talk about needing a bold and energetic executive, and they fear that without immunity, future presidents will be too scared to make tough decisions. A chilling effect, they call it. But then you have the dissenters, and they're saying, whoa, hold on. This creates a law-free zone. Their focus is on accountability, arguing that things like impeachment just aren't enough to stop a president from abusing their power.
And this wasn't some squeaker of a decision. It was a decisive 6-3 split, which really shows you the deep ideological divide on the court right now when it comes to executive power.
And if you want to understand the majority's thinking, just look at what Chief Justice Roberts wrote himself. They put the effective discharge of a president's powers above the public's interest in a criminal trial. It's all about keeping the executive branch running smoothly, in their view, even at the cost of individual accountability.
Now, to show just how dangerous they thought this was, the dissenters came up with a really shocking hypothetical. They asked, could a president order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival and get away with it? And under this new ruling, they argued the answer is yes. Why? Because directing the military is a core presidential power, so it would get absolute immunity, no matter how evil the reason.
Okay, so let's get practical. What did all of this mean for the actual case against Donald Trump? Well, the impact was huge and it was immediate.
The Supreme Court didn't just throw the case out, they sent it back down, but with a bunch of new instructions that basically took a carving knife to the prosecution's case. For example, they ruled that any talks Trump had with his Department of Justice were absolutely immune. Done. His pressure campaign on Mike Pence, that was labeled presumptively immune, a really high bar for prosecutors to clear. And that whole fake elector scheme, well, they sent that back for what they called a fact-specific analysis, kicking off a whole new, long legal battle.
And here's the real-world consequence of all that legal wrangling. By sending the case back for all these new hearings and analyses, the court pretty much guaranteed that there was no way a trial was going to happen before the 2024 presidential election. In effect, the delay was the decision. All right, so that brings us to the next big question everyone is asking. The Supreme Court created this shield, so can anyone or anything take it away? Okay, so there are basically three main paths people are talking about to reverse this. But let me tell you, none of them are easy.
On one hand, you have a constitutional amendment. That's the gold standard, super permanent. But the catch? You need a massive consensus, 2/3 of Congress and 38 states. Politically, that's almost a non-starter today. The other option is a new law, something like the No Kings Act. This would be way faster, but it's built on a really controversial idea called jurisdiction stripping. It's basically Congress telling the Supreme Court what cases it can and can't hear. And there's a real chance the Supreme Court would just turn around and declare that law unconstitutional.
Okay, so let's boil this all down. What are the big takeaways? First, the Supreme Court created a brand new, three-tiered system for presidential immunity. Second, this gives former presidents this massive shield, either absolute or presumptive immunity for their official acts. Third, the ruling clearly values the function of the presidency over the accountability of the person in the office. Fourth, it effectively slammed the brakes on the 2020 election subversion trial. And finally, trying to go back to the way things were before, it faces some truly massive hurdles.
So the court has drawn new lines around presidential power. And that leaves us with a really big question. If it's not the courts, then who will define those limits next? You could argue that the ultimate check on presidential power has now shifted from the courthouse to the ballot box, putting the final say directly in the hands of voters.
Thank you for joining us for this explainer. If you want to dive deeper, you can find the links to all the source materials right there in the description.